Good evening and welcome to the 12th Annual Untold Nauvoo Story Symposium. My name is Joseph Johnston, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening, and I will be serving in dual roles tonight as host and presenter. We greatly appreciate you joining us this evening for a night of Nauvoo history. The annual Untold Nauvoo Story Symposium traditionally celebrates the full gamut of Nauvoo's history, including its Native American peoples, its origins as a river town, its role in the history of the Latter-day Saints, its place in the Utopian Icarian movement, its appeal to German immigrants, its Catholic heritage, including the Sisters of St. Benedict and their focus on education, its significance in Midwest viticulture, its reflection of trends in American agriculture, and its rebirth as a point of heritage tourism. In years past, we have gathered in person and shared multiple presentations over the course of 2 days. The gathering is a venue for telling stories of Nauvoo and the surrounding area that are not yet widely known. Courtesy of the pandemic, now in its second year, we are offering a condensed program. Our annual gathering this weekend would not be our annual gathering this weekend would not be possible without our generous sponsors. And I would like to take a moment to extend our gratitude to the City of Nauvoo, the Nauvoo Area Chamber of Commerce, the Nauvoo Tourism Office, the Joseph Smith Historic Site, and Historic Nauvoo. Without you, tonight would not be possible. Thank you very much for your support. Now let me tell you what we can expect tonight. I'll wrap up my opening remarks about 7:06 Central Time and transition into presentation mode as I share my paper titled Tomb of Joseph Museum. My presentation will last approximately 40 minutes in length. Immediately following my presentation, we will hear from Paul DeBarth and Robert Smith in a presentation titled I Dig Nauvoo. Following this second presentation, we will open up the floor for questions from the audience. Our evening program will then finish around 8:45 p.m., making it an enjoyable evening of Nauvoo history. Before we begin, a few friendly reminders. We are using the webinar format in Zoom, a program designed specifically for lectures like this. Only the guest speaker and hosts have the video feature. However, there is plenty of time for you to share with one another through the chat feature, which you can find down at the bottom of your screen. You will find the chat symbols as well as the Q&A symbols and many other things down there. Consider introducing yourself and let the group know where you're from. Also, I anticipate that tonight's presentations will inspire a lot of questions from the audience. Please post your questions throughout tonight's program using the Q&A feature that appears at the bottom of the screen. That is the Q&A feature, not the chat, the Q&A. When the two presentations conclude, we will go first to the questions already in the queue of the Q&A chat, of the Q&A area, excuse me. This concludes my opening remarks. And now I will go ahead and transition into speaker mode, as I will share tonight about the Tomb of Joseph Museum. Let my father, Don Carlos, Alvin, and children that I have buried be brought and laid in the tomb that I have built. Let my mother and my brethren and my sisters be laid there also. And let it be called the Tomb of Joseph, a descendant of Jacob. And when I die, let me be gathered to the tomb of my father. Reading the full entry from Joseph Smith's personal journal for August 23rd, 1842 is just as heartbreaking today. By that time, Joseph Smith had already lost his father, 2 brothers, and 5 children. This that we have here is the oldest record we have mentioning the tomb of Joseph. We don't know when the construction started for the tomb of Joseph, but it's clear that it was underway by the summer of 1842. We also don't know who designed it, but William Weeks, the architect for the Nauvoo Temple, did make two drawings that have managed to survive in the archives of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Salt Lake City. From these two, we see that it was made of cut and finished stone, and it had two unique features. One, that it had two chambers. The second one is water coming out underneath. By June of 1844, the tomb was nearly finished. But then on June 7th, 1844, the Nauvoo Expositor came off the press with its scandalous stories of what was going on behind closed doors in Nauvoo. On the 10th of June, the city council declared it a public nuisance and ordered the Nauvoo police force to do what they do with any other nuisance, get rid of it. But that only made things worse. One thing quickly led to another, and before long, Joseph Smith, his brother Hiram, and most of the rest of the Nauvoo City Council were on their way to Carthage to answer for the charge of riot. On his way to Carthage on Monday, the 24th of June, 1844, with a sense of foreboding weighing on him, Joseph Smith stopped for a moment at the tomb and told one of his friends, Brother Cahoon, "Have the floors laid and the doors hung to my sepulcher." He had a feeling that he would soon need it. Joseph and Hiram were killed the following Thursday, June 27th. On Saturday the 29th, a public viewing was held in the dining hall of the Nauvoo mansion, and a large public funeral was held immediately thereafter. While the funeral sermon was being preached by W.W. Phelps, hearses carrying the coffins to the Nauvoo City Cemetery on the edge of town went by. But those coffins didn't contain the bodies of Joseph and Hiram. They were in another set of coffins, which were secretly buried that night in the basement of the Nauvoo House, the 4-story hotel that was under construction across the street from Joseph and Emma's mansion house. Joseph's wishes. The tomb, of course, wasn't finished. But when Brigham Young got back into town in August, one of the first things he did was to direct the temple construction workers to get back to work on the tomb. That October, the doors had been hung and the floors laid, and the tomb was complete. Joseph Smith, it seems, made Brigham Young promise to have his remains interred in the tomb along with those of his family members. But it wasn't only Brigham Young that made this promise. There were several other people who left written records that Joseph Smith made them swear to take care of his body and see that it was placed in his tomb with his family. But Emma wasn't having any of it. There was a bounty on Joseph Smith's head, and someone wanted to collect. Emma was not willing to take chances with her husband's remains, no matter who promised what to whom. Someone undoubtedly pointed out to Brigham Young that less than 2 weeks after the false coffins were buried in the Nauvoo City Cemetery, someone dug them up looking to claim the bounty. In September, Emma Smith moved herself and the children out of the spacious new Nauvoo mansion back across the street to the old log cabin we know as the homestead. Once that was done, she had the remains of Joseph and Hiram taken out of the homestead, again in secrecy, taken out of the Nauvoo house basement and buried in the yard of the homestead, again in secrecy, where she could watch over them personally from her own front window. Making one last appeal, Brigham Young got up in the church's October 1845 General Conference and declared, "We will petition Sister Emma in the name of Israel's God to let us deposit the remains of Joseph according as he commanded us. And if she will not consent to it, our garments are clear. Then when he awakes in the morning of the resurrection, he shall talk with her and not with me." Emma Smith still did not consent, and Joseph Smith's body never occupied his tomb. But that tomb did see use. In May of 1845, Caroline Grant Smith, the wife of William Smith, the last of the surviving Smith brothers, died and was interred there. As the Illinois spring turned into summer, however, the temple construction workers began to complain to Brother William that his wife's remains, to use the Book of Mormon word, stinketh. So she was disinterred and buried in the yard of the homestead, not too far from where Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith were still secretly buried. Then in September of 1846, as the Battle of Nauvoo raged between anti-Mormons and the sickest and poorest of the Latter-day Saints still left in Nauvoo, David Norris, William Anderson, and William's 14-year-old son, August, were killed. They couldn't be buried in the city cemetery because it was behind enemy lines. So they were placed in the tomb until the battle was over, then buried out in the Nauvoo City Cemetery. In 1853, the Icarian community was in Nauvoo, and a visitor noted that the French Society was using the structure as a milk cooler. The last record we have of somebody directly visiting the tomb of Joseph was Franklin D. Richards in 1885. Richards had been a friend of Joseph Smith's, and by 1885, he was serving in the Utah Church's Quorum of the 12 Apostles. Writing to the Salt Lake Deseret News, Richards said that one of the first things he did once he reached Nauvoo was to seek out the tomb of Joseph. He wrote, "We sought out the spot and found the vault included within a building where it was used for a wine cellar." In 2005, Zion's Mercantile was constructed. This is kitty corner to the now reconstructed Nauvoo Temple. The vacant lot that was there had become occupied by a statue garden known as Legacy Garden. But in 2005, as mentioned, the store was built on that spot. In the construction process, a sprinkler system was installed to keep the grass green year-round. In the process of installing these sprinklers, there was one particular head that sat at the corner of the sidewalk and the walkway to the front door. The sprinkler head refused to go down and kept getting struck by lawnmowers as they would make their rounds. Eventually, the owner of the Mercantile called the sprinkler company back to come and fix the sprinkler head and set it down lower. In the process of trying to set it down lower, he dug down and found out that the reason the sprinkler head would not sit lower was because there was a rock underneath. In digging at that rock, he found that it was a good size rock. And then he dug a little more and found it was bigger and then bigger and then bigger. Eventually, he needed a pry bar to get the rock out. And he successfully did that only to discover that there was a large hole underneath. This sprinkler worker quickly called the owner of the facility and said, "Hey, there's a hole in the front yard where the sprinkler was." Well, the owner of the Mercantile said, "Fill it up." And the sprinkler man said, "No, I don't think you understand. There's a hole here that you need to come and see." So the owner of the facility got his 12-year-old son and they came on over to the Zion's Mercantile and they looked at this hole to discover that it was further and deeper than any of them could reach. So quickly they went around Nauvoo and found someone who had a digital camera. They reached their arm in and snapped a couple of pictures with the digital camera, only to pull it back out and look at the pictures to discover that there was something in there. They could see stone walls and brick walls and a brick arch. Curious about this, the owner asked his 12-year-old son if he felt up to going on an adventure, getting a little Indiana Jones action in. He quickly agreed, of course, and in the process of figuring out how to get him in, they worked him down in there head first. Once he was to his shoulders, this 12-year-old boy said, "You know what, Dad, I don't find this comfortable," and asked to be pulled back out. And there it sat for several years without anybody further exploring. In 2020, new owners took over the facility. Brian Christensen and his family purchased the property. Immediately thereafter, Brian was told about this hole there in the front yard. He quickly got a couple of friends together and started to dig. One of the first things that they wanted to do was explore what was down in this hole. In digging and opening up more space, Brian was able to sink a ladder down into the hole and discovered that it was a large vault. A vault that measures 7 feet deep by 26 feet wide, which are about the same dimensions as William Weeks's renderings for the tomb of Joseph, minus that dividing wall. And you can see on the left of this image that there is some kind of a hole that went up in the ceiling. Now, originally, we just wanted to explore it. Then adding on to the project, we just wanted to make a 6-foot wide path where tourists could come down and view the hole and see the vault inside there. So we called the backhoe company and they started to excavate, and we kept finding things. And pretty soon it was expanded to a full-fledged excavation with backhoes, concrete saws, and cement trucks. In the process of this digging, we of course found many items. Here's the vault cleaned up. Among the items we found were many stones. You can see we found a barrel, 2 barrel forms, stones, broken glass, various farm implements, bottles, and many frogs that had learned how to survive in this vault. Now, amongst the stones that we found, there were 2 interesting ones. Most of what we found was rubble, but there were 2 in particular that showed great curious things on them. And then amongst the things that we found, we had to figure out what was going on here with all these farm implements. We learned that this was a site where Joseph F. Oshner and his wife, Julia M., built a beautiful 2-story building with a walkout basement in 1899. This beautiful building stood for 50 years until it was destroyed by a fire in 1949. With those curious stones, they turned out to be very exciting finds. In studying these, we figured out that they were part of the Nauvoo house, the hotel commanded by Revelation, the same Revelation as the Nauvoo temple. Here are the measurements. We're comparing them with the Nauvoo house there. We learned that not only had these stones come from the Nauvoo house, but several lintel stones, window lintel stones, had also come from the Nauvoo house. 6 that we can see in this one picture. But those weren't the only stones that came from the Nauvoo house. Also included that Joseph F. Oshner purchased was the cornerstone from the Nauvoo house that housed the original manuscript for the Book of Mormon for many years. And it's very curious, this cornerstone was eventually donated back to the Community of Christ after the death of Joseph Oshner by his widow, Julia M. Julia M. was Julia Moffett Oshner. Julia is undoubtedly named after Joseph and Emma Smith's Julia. It was in her home growing up when she was 12 years old that Julia Murdoch Smith came to live and spend out her final days. Now remember, oh, there we go. Remember that hole that went up in the ceiling? Well, it was just the right size. You can see it in the Ochsner picture here. It was just the right size for lowering down from the street level into the cool vault, blocks of ice cut from the Mississippi River. This is what we believe our vault was used for. An old ice vault. The sidewalk access made it quick and easy to fill the room, and a door in the basement for the occupants to take the ice out, including for an ice cream shop that Joseph Ochsner rented to. So once we got going with our investigation, Brian Christensen hired a group to come out and create a documentary film for us. We hired Phil Tuckett as a director. Tuckett has directed and produced many of the best NFL film productions and has won 40 Emmy Awards. T.C. Christensen was our cinematographer. He has directed Trail of Hope, Story of the Mormon Trail, Joseph Smith, Prophet of the Restoration, 17 Miracles, and scores of other films. Another great person hired for the cast was Nino Russell for costumes, whose work has been included in the Showtime series The Good Lord Bird and PBS's Mercy Street, among others. Robert Willard for special effects, whose 72 special effects credits include Top Gun, The Untouchables, Waterworld, and The Last Samurai. Diane Millett was our head of production design and art direction. And she's done such wonderful works as Touched by an Angel, Everwood, and Teen Chef Pro. And of course, we had Hal Cannon write the soundtrack and perform it with Three Hat Trio. Hal's work for NPR and various cowboy poetry venues earned him high praise. But it's his performance of 19th century songs as part of the Deseret String Band that earned him an attempted hire for my wedding reception 24 years ago. He was unavailable, unfortunately. His music, much like John Williams for Star Wars, really brings the whole movie together. In our 2020 filming, we assembled cast and crew that interviewed some of the best historians working today, such as Alex Smith, Jennifer Reeder, and Christopher Blythe, as well as Garrett Dirkmatt and Gordon Madsen of the Joseph Smith Papers. Benjamin Park, author of Kingdom of Nauvoo, the rise and fall of a religious empire on the American frontier. Scott Esplin, author of Return to the City of Joseph, Modern Mormonism's Contest for the Soul of Nauvoo. Greg Prince, author of Having Authority, the origins and development of priesthood during the ministry of Joseph Smith, as well as David O. McKay and the Rise of Modern Mormonism. Devery Anderson, author of Joseph Smith's Quorum of the Anointed, 1842 through 1845, a documentary history, an upcoming biography of Willard Richards, and his Emmett Till, The Murder That Shocked the World and Propelled the Civil Rights Movement, not only has earned him high praise, but it was turned into the ABC miniseries that many of you may have recently seen called Women of the Movement. We also had interviews with Bob Smith, who will be presenting in just a little bit. And he is one of the founders of I Dig Nauvoo, the archaeological crew that comes out to Nauvoo nearly every year to help us figure out what Nauvoo looked like back in the 1840s. We also interviewed local historians like Mary Logan, Durrell Nelson, Robert Wright, Robert Cook, and jean shirts. In 2021, we filmed reenactments in and around Nauvoo at some beautiful locations, including the Cambry House, the Reinberger House Museum, the Weld House Museum, the George M. Verity Riverboat Museum in Keokuk, the Hamilton Boat Launch, and what I think may be the last undeveloped parcel of land between Nauvoo and Hamilton. We also had a great list of actors and extras, including many locals. From our investigations, we discovered, and we now know, that this vault is not the tomb of Joseph, but it is so close in size and location that it makes it a terrific setting for telling the story of Joseph Smith's tomb. We have enough evidence for its actual location on the temple block along Mulholland to turn the hypothesis that we've developed into a theory, but we need an actual physical search to turn that theory into fact. Perhaps someday the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints will do some ground penetrating radar on that site, but I don't expect that to happen anytime soon. Joseph Smith eventually received his wish to be interred with his family, but not quite as he imagined. All of his family members who died in Nauvoo were gathered together and interred in the Smith family cemetery in the yard of the old log cabin homestead. The tomb itself is a symbol. Now, the general understanding is that it was nothing more than a burial chamber, but it's considerably more important than that. It was located on Nauvoo's temple block, and with its location there on the temple block, Joseph Smith was making a pronouncement that he wanted all the world to see and hear. He was announcing that Jesus Christ broke the bonds of death, that death really will lose its sting, and that families and friends can be united in eternity. Joseph Smith considered friends to be family, and that we, as friends and brothers and sisters, have a social obligation to help our brothers and sisters in Christ. While many Christian churches have called each other brothers and sisters for centuries, Joseph Smith actually believed it and practiced it. That's evidenced by his tomb. Not only was his family meant to be interred there, but in that second chamber, it was meant for his friend, Sidney Rigdon. Friendship, Joseph Smith said in one of his sermons, is like Brother Turley in his blacksmith shop, welding iron to iron. It unites the human family with its happy influence. Put another way, love thy neighbor as thyself. The song that John Taylor sang in the Carthage jail that was asked to be sung again was A Poor Wayfaring Man of Grief, which is all about loving your neighbor. In one of his sermons where he talked about the tomb, Joseph Smith described Nauvoo as a place for saints to learn how to live together, die together, and how to rise together. In the end, it's love that matters. As the Tomb of Joseph Museum, we're going to tell this story in a lot more depth than I've been able to present tonight, and present it in a visual, vocal, physical, and tangible way. I would like to invite each and every one of you to come and visit us. We plan to open to the public in early March and have a grand opening in May. And if you're in the Nauvoo area, the Tomb of Joseph documentary film will be showing at the LDS Film Festival in Provo, Utah on March 3rd. We are currently in negotiations for theatrical release of the Tomb of Joseph film in movie theaters. And we're also negotiating to have the DVD and Blu-ray distribution and streaming service available on platforms sometime in the spring and summer. It looks like those plans will be finalized in the next few weeks. Keep checking thetombofjoseph.com for official word. And of course, CDs of Hal Cannon's remarkable soundtrack to the Tomb of Joseph will be available at Zion's Mercantile in the spring. Thank you very much. Now I'll take off my presenter hat. Our second presentation this evening will be led by Paul DeBarth and Robert Smith. Let me share with you a little background information about our presenters. Paul DeBarth, lead archaeologist at the Joseph Smith Historic Site in Nauvoo, began work there with Robert Bray in 1971. Served as crew chief and on-site director from 1975 to 84, and has returned in retirement to team up with Lachlan Mackay and Bob Smith and I Dig Nauvoo. Paul has published at least 8 fantastic archaeological reports on Midwest locations, predominantly Nauvoo. He is contracted to publish several more monographs on Nauvoo with the John Whitmer Historical Association in a series on history and archaeology. These include the Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy Mack Smith home site in Nauvoo, the Orrin Porter Rockwell bar site and barbershop, excuse me, the prehistory of Nauvoo, its Native American settlement, as well as a major work on Joseph and Emma Smith's Nauvoo mansion. Bob Smith is a retired professor from BYU and is a descendant of Samuel Smith. And he's volunteered to facilitate the archaeological excavations. The archaeological excavations and restorations at Nauvoo. He and his wife Becky have been investigating this project, have been investing in the project since 2012. Paul and Bob, I'll turn it over to you here.
Thank you, Joseph, for that introduction. Special thanks to the Joseph Smith Historic Sites, or site, I should say, and the Historic Sites Foundation, and for Nauvoo's Untold Stories for this opportunity. For those who don't know, I Dig Nauvoo is an archaeological project that for the last 10 years has been a cooperative effort from the Joseph Smith Historic Site and the Samuel H. Smith Foundation. Now, over the years, I've been asked this question: how did you ever get involved with doing an archaeological dig? Now, I have to correct Joseph right now. For those that know me, I grew up in Panguitch and Nephi, Utah, and I started my 35 years of BYU peeling potatoes. I'm not a professor at BYU, nor have I ever been a professor, but I work for dining services, and that's how I started. But they'll ask me, how did you get involved with an archaeological dig? And the short answer I'd give was, well, when you step forth on the good old ship Zion, it's amazing where it takes you sometimes. The actual reason, or the beginnings of modern day I Dig Nauvoo, began with the desire of finding the last 2 members of the Smith family that are in unmarked graves, Don Carlos Smith and Samuel Harrison Smith. Finding these 2 forgotten brothers was like putting a big puzzle together. Fortunately, some very important pieces came together by some talented individuals. One of them you just listened to, Joseph Johnston. He found a letter from Mercy Thompson that was written to her nephew, Joseph F. Smith. Now, this letter was inspired because she was reading in the Deseret News in Salt Lake City, and it talked about the Smith family cemetery. And in it, they said we could obtain some information that maybe Samuel and Don Carlos, two of the prophet's brothers, were also interned there. Well, she read that. She wrote this letter to Joseph F. and said, not only are they buried there, but so is my husband, Robert Thompson, was buried with them. And we put a stone on their grave and moved the stone upside down so that it would not be discovered. It was like 4 foot long by 2 feet wide. So it was a big stone. And that she wondered if they had ever uncovered it. She did say that they put it upside down. And Locke Mackay found that this practice of putting grave markers upside down was used for 2 other graves during that same period. In Locke's example, it was the Captain Anderson and his son, the 2 victims of the Battle of Nauvoo. The historical department of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints provide us another great piece of the puzzle. They found the journal of George F. Richards, who was a new apostle for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And he was attending a meeting with Joseph F. Smith, who was then the president of their church. And he was talking about the contract that they had with Mahonri Young to put the statues of Joseph and Hiram on Temple Square. And in that, Joseph F. started telling the story of how when they were bringing the bodies of the Smith family to the cemetery, that they did it at night, and the next morning he actually went down where they were doing this and saw the coffin of Don Carlos, and the corner had been broken, and he actually looked in and saw the decomposing body of Don Carlos. What was interesting about that is that he gave us the idea that this was kind of a mass grave in that area. Now, the third bit of information was found by the archives in the Community of Christ in Independence. Barbara, and I'm going to mess up her last name, so Paul, correct me if I get it wrong. Bernauer, thank you. Well, anyway, she found a bit of information that through family tradition, Joseph Byron Smith had given an account of where the bodies of Father and Mother Smith were buried, and also where Samuel and Don Carlos were buried in the cemetery. Unfortunately, no one in the family ever wrote it down, and all we had was this family tradition. Well, Barbara found a letter that was informing President Wallace B. Smith of the account from Joseph Byron. And this letter, he described correctly where Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy Mack were buried. And there you go. Another gem of information came from the Community Christ Archive also. It was found by Ron Romick. This was a letter from Joseph III to his son Israel, asking him to come to Independence to meet his cousin Joseph B. Smith, a postman in Salt Lake City. And young Joseph said that he had brought his little tyke son named Byron. This put Joseph Byron in a position to know where his great-grandfather Samuel was buried from a first-hand source. In the summer well, actually, it was the spring of 2011. I had a meeting with John McBride, a geology professor at BYU. I told him the need to scan all of the Smith Cemetery, and John quickly volunteered to do the scanning since he was meeting with Ben Pickles, a professor in Potsdam, and doing some work for him in the summer of 2011 in Nauvoo. I was given permission by Locke and Kristen to lay out the Smith Cemetery in grids, and when it was done, Ben, John, and Bill Keach, also a professor at BYU and the U of U, then came over and did the work of scanning the entire cemetery with ground penetrating radar. I always remember Ben as we were going around where the lilacs are, and he was watching John's monitor, and he said, "John, this looks like a mass grave." Later, John and Bill put together a report showing the disturbances around the lilac plants, the same place where Joseph Byron had said Samuel and Don Carlos were buried. Later, Bill Keach made a 3D cemetery map, which he made the observation when he shared it with me that he didn't see any other place where was a mass grave with several individuals could be in the cemetery except for the lilac area. They also found the location of Louis Bideman, and we were able to actually mark that grave. During that time, I was introduced to this photo. Here, George Anderson had the wife of the Central States Mission, Sister Benyon, stand with an elder to mark Emma's grave. Sister Benyon's companion had assignment to stand by Arthur's grave, son of Joseph III and Emmeline. I remember thinking as I was looking at this picture the first time, wondering where the elder's companion was. This picture was taken back when my grandfather had visited that spot just a few years later. When I looked at that, all of a sudden, when I blew up where around the lilacs were, there was the companion standing, doing his job of marking what I believe was another grave, and what I believe was also the stone that Mercy Thompson talked that she had put there. That summer, I had the distinct opportunity to recreate that Anderson picture. It was interesting that we discovered that when George Anderson took the picture, he was given permission to climb on top of the homestead, the Joseph Smith III portion, put his tripod on the top of the ridge, and then he leaned up against the chimney that's up there. And there you have it. There's our BYU students that came with Bill and John, and we marked out exactly where those people were when they took the picture back in 1907. This is Bill Keach finding the targets of the Joseph Smith home. Later that day, he found hits for the Samuel H. Smith site. Locke also invited this guy from Independence, or I should say Kansas City, who was keeping the professors busy around the homestead looking for privies. It was during one of the meals that I met Paul DeBarth. It didn't take long for Paul and I to get thinking on exploring the sites that had just discovered with the GR ground penetrating radar. From that, now you know how I Dig Nauvoo started. Paul and I have been together on this project for over 10 years now. I totally respect Paul. He's a great treasure. We also have more archaeologists now, Kathy and Shane, but Paul's the lead, and we just love him to death. So with that, Paul, why don't we have you go through the 10 years of I Dig Nauvoo and talk about some of the neat things you found, or we found during those 10 years.
Thank you, Bob. It's a pleasure to be able to share with you this evening and with all of the good guests. The first project of idignauvoo.com was instituted in 2012, and it was to test around the homestead for evidence of a possible trading post, as had been discussed in many of the tours, but it would have predated the Mormon period. And so a set of squares was tested. One next to the Main Street property line on the east proved especially productive. It was located beneath a beautiful hackberry tree, providing shade for the volunteers, and a parade of individuals and families took turns working there with everyone discovering artifactual material. Let me say that again. Everyone discovered artifactual material, and almost, I think we've not had any volunteers that have not discovered any artifacts to this point. Not all of it was of the Mormon period, of course. As we dug into the second foot below the surface, levels 6 through 10 at 2/10 of a foot per level, we found Aboriginal grit-tempered pottery as well as a few Mormon period pieces. Chert chips and flakes began to proliferate, and by level 11, they became concentrated enough that I determined to map the concentration. So after dinner, in the cool of the evening, I sat on the east side of the square, looking west, and plotted in the tiny chips and larger flakes. A brush to clean and clear, and then fragments on the grid paper, and then suddenly I realized I was mapping chert distribution that matched my leg positions. With legs crossed, a triangle formed between them, and there was a triangular pile of chert chips and flakes. To the left, in front, and to the right of my legs, additional chert debitage was evident. We had a few larger samples of the chert cores and found a lanceolate point in the square nearby with the same stratigraphic stains, so we were able to date the napper to 5,000 years ago. To look up and see the beautiful river to the south, the sunset to the west, and the pleasant terrace on which I worked emoted a profound connection with the history and prehistory I was privileged to uncover. And so we have kinsmen, 5,000 years apart. Square 385, level 11, produced quantities of chert chips and flakes. In the evening, I mapped clipboard showing 4 clusters by my legs. One to the left, one to the right, one in front, a triangle in the center. Near them, a lanceolate point napped by one no longer an experimenter. The same stains from the chert deposit in the Mississippian limestone laid when the inland sea covered from Mexico to Canada, and it called this place its home. The napper worked to make his tool, the debitage evident at hand. 5,000 years ago, he sat upon this land, working, looking west, the lovely river on his left, seeking balance, penetrative quality, sharp edges in his heft. And here was I, working, seeking to understand, admiring the sunset over this beautiful historic land, legs in the same position as the one from long ago, separated by millennia, yet I met him there, in a sense, to know, for we sat and worked together, although thousands of years apart, and it made us friends, co-workers, brothers, kinsmen of one heart. Kinsmen share the joys of life, the labors, dreams, heartaches, appreciations, as do we of little piles of chert flakes. And that is the view looking past the homestead for that square. In those squares, we find quite a lot of Mormon artifacts, and you can see from square 304, level 4, that we have 68 ceramics found, 7 window glass, 2 container glass, including the pontil scar, which shows up in the bottle in the upper left. That's the base of the bottle. and then ferrous artifacts and bones, and then below that the Aboriginal artifacts showed up. The earliest of the Aboriginal artifacts are from the mammoth hunters, and they're represented by the hardened quarter notch point on your left. That is a point created from the Keokuk chert, and it would date about 10,000 years. It was found on the Joseph Smith Sr. site on N156-2. The portrayal of the mammoth is from the Anthropology Museum in Mexico City, where they also have found mammoths that have been killed, and the bones demonstrate that they have been eaten. And so, for us to be sharing in that kind of dietary matter from 10,000 years ago is fascinating. Snake River drainage near the site near Oskaloosa, Iowa, provided our crew with opportunity to excavate and help reclaim the remains of 4 mammoths whose bones had been scattered. To appreciate the size of a tooth as large as an adult human head, and recognize that our hunters in Nauvoo, 100 miles downstream, had 10,000 years ago harvested them, offered an educational perspective for our volunteers. Dr. C. Smith holding a 4-foot ribs from the Snake River Basin near Oskaloosa, Iowa. Unfortunately, Steve is our bone specialist. My understanding is that he died just a month ago. So we'll be missing him. And thank you, Steve, for all the good service you provided us. All right. The tusk of the mammoth found in the Oskaloosa area was 23 inches in diameter, and it had 30 annual growth rings. So it put it probably in the range of 15 feet long. To imagine facing such a creature and invite it home for dinner with a stick and a stone persuader is clearly most daunting. The mammoth hunters were followed by bison hunters on our site at Nauvoo. Here we have Robert T. Bray and Rena DeBarth pedestaling a skeleton with 3 associated lanceolate points dated to roughly 5,000 years. These were found on the Mansion House site, N147-1, in the garden in 1983. That was during the University of Missouri Columbia project, which hosted a field school on the site from 1970 to 1984. And that provided the impetus then for I Dig Nauvoo, which has been from 2012 until the present. The lithics of the archaic, and you can see these points were found in 3 of these points were found in company with a dog skeleton. Lanceolate points like these are characteristic of the late archaic, and they'll date from 5,000 to 2,500 years of age. Bison used to live east of the Mississippi, and the Des Moines Rapids provided one of the few places where they could cross in water less than 3 feet deep, less than 2 feet deep in dry seasons. So for the small calves, you see that made it a safe place to cross. The dozen or so lanceolate points found indicate significant occupation of the site for a significant period, that is 10,000 to 3,000 years ago, in which hunters harvested the huge beast with regularity. To imagine a herd of 100 bison lunging up the riverbank, shaking off the water with bulls and cows lowing and protecting the calves, how does one approach a group like this with a dinner invitation? Our excavations have also found the earliest pottery in the Midwest from 2,500 years ago. It's found on the Homestead site and on the Joseph Smith Sr. site, and this pioneering effort to transform clay into vessels for grain storage and water and cooking allowed greater sedimentation and larger settlements than had been feasible in the earlier periods. So I Dig Nauvoo uncovered numerous samples with care because Aboriginal pottery looks a lot like dirt and must be approached with caution.
Well, Paul, let's talk about our next place of digging, and that was the Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy Mack double log cabin site. And we were there about 2 years.
Okay, you showed a picture of a painting of a double log house, and then we have the Robert Campbell painting of June 18 of 1844. The declaration of martial law in Nauvoo demonstrated to the rest of Illinois that the Mormons were in an independent state within the state of Illinois. The charter provided for the militia and municipal courts that had defended Smith from arrest. Having destroyed the Nauvoo Expositor on June 10 as a nuisance, the free press provision of the Bill of Rights had been violated. Interestingly, at Alton, Illinois in 1837, publisher Elijah Lovejoy had 2 presses destroyed, and he was lynched and killed for advocating abolition with his free press. But people of Illinois at the time did not like abolitionists nor Mormons, and many people in Nauvoo were both. The painting shows the Legion gathered at the corner of Main and Water Streets, the mansion house on the left, Joseph and others on the stand adjacent to the double log house of Joseph and Lucy Mack Smith on the right. The excavation because this place had been plowed out, we had to determine the location, the footprint of the house on the basis of the daub and artifact scatter. You see a sample of mortar on the left, daub next to it, and then Chuck Tripp is marking in the square he's working on. You see little white nails. Those nails are marking where he has found the daub scattered across the square. And I believe that's level 4. And on the north profile, he cut this small arc, and that arc did not have any daub in it, but there's daub scattered on both sides of it. And the density of the daub scatter spread, and so this arc marks the likely location of the footings for the foundation of the porch for the double log house. To find the ceramic samples and the glasswares and the flatware designs associated with the structure provides positive evidence for reconstructing and redecorating with authentic artifacts. That to me is exciting. The King's pattern evident here is a clear demonstration of the benefit of archaeology to the reconstruction process. Plain undecorated flatware has also been found, and it may have been for everyday use, while the decorated wares may well have been reserved for special occasions. So an indulgent grandchild may have been responsible for the loss, or it may simply have been misplaced in the moving process, but it's a significant find to find the flatware actually used in the double log house of Joseph and Lucy Smith. This Spanish real was identified by John Walthall. Notice the worn silver coin was found in square 34, level 3. This is the type that was sewn in the armpit of a coat, so that if the person was robbed, the hidden means of exchange would still be available. Typically, half real Spanish coins were used in this manner in the late 1700s, and I really appreciate the mentorship of John Walthall for helping out with that kind of information. Governor Ford came to Nauvoo looking for bogus coins, or the bogus blanks, on June 27 of 1844, the day when Joseph and Hiram were shot and killed in Carthage. He gave a speech from the stand at the corner of Main and Water Streets, ironically within a few feet of where we found this questionable coin shown here. Not only does it not meet the weight standard for the coin, experts identify a dozen or more telltale flaws that make it most likely to have been illicit. Theodore Turley, Joseph's neighbor to the east, testified to the Nauvoo City Council that the Law brothers had brought bogus dies to him to fix. He later was arrested in Alton, Illinois in 1845 on charges of bogus making. A button, remarkable button on Joseph Smith Sr. site, speaks of the elite. It was found in the north portion of the double log house in soil beneath our feet. Buttons normally have a maker's mark, but this one celebrates the tailors. What a lark. Someone had a suit made by the tailors in New York, then lost the button on our site, not far from a two-tine fork. And we are left to speculate whether the button popped because of too much weight, or was it lost by one who came to implore the parents of the prophet to get access to his door? Was it lost by the governor? It clearly was not someone poor. One who had traveled far and wide, perhaps with the sword and Bible at his side? A tradition says Smith had a New York suit too ostentatious to be an attribute which in Kirtland he could not wear. But in Nauvoo, where he served as general, mayor, and a whole bunch of other roles, perhaps he did not care. I would point out that my initial reading on that was Mavers instead of Mayors. And so I sent it to Ken Farnsworth, and he's the one that did the fine research to more accurately define it. We work with volunteers. The last day of our excavation on the Joseph Smith Senior site was June 27, the day celebrating the anniversary of the assassination by a graveside commemoration. We were advised that 100 volunteers were coming from Council Bluffs. That was daunting because 30 volunteers on a day is more than enough. But I warned the dig crew, and we prepared the crew members to supervise 3 volunteers per square. And a group of 30 volunteers would take turns digging, screening, washing artifacts, while another group set up chairs for the commemoration, and a third group visited the red brick store. Everyone appeared to be happy with the rotation, and then the buses pulled in from Council Bluffs. The first 100 had already come from St. Louis. It was a bit overwhelming, but we doubled up a bit and employed as many of our crew could supervise. Spencer Parrott, one of the 200 volunteers on that day we were closing the site, found a half dime dated 1835 in square 55, level 5. This put the coin central to the north structure where we think the Smiths resided. Lucy is recorded as having charged 2 bits for guests to see the mummies in the upper room. While the coincidence of a coin of that date with the history and excavation does not necessarily associate with the mummies, the possible association is positive evidence construable to support the story attributed to the site. It's amazing how lucky some people are. With excavations complete and grass again growing, the site where Joseph Smith Sr. died in 1840 is marked for future reconstruction. The plan is to build a prototype at the north side of the Camp Nauvoo to be used as an archaeological facility, and then to build an authentic reconstruction on the site. And the archaeological facility will be used during the archaeological season, and then will be available for rental by Camp Nauvoo to other guests during the rest of the year. The double log house at the Living History Farms near Des Moines, Iowa, matches the footprint of the house we attempted to find through archaeology on Block 155-2 in Nauvoo. The foundation had been plowed out, so we had to determine the location on the basis of the artifact scatter and the daub scatter. We did so. Finding daub concentrations is extremely helpful with the artifacts in a structure measuring roughly 25 feet east-west by 40 feet north and south. It seemed unlikely to have a log house that big, but the evidence of thousands of artifacts and pieces of daub prevailed, and the evidence is presented in our report.
Well, Paul, now we go to the Porter Rockwell store, and as Joseph snickered when we barbershop, we were there for 2014 and 2015.
Here's a picture of Richard and Norma Graham. They were involved in 3 generations of their family in the excavation of the Porter Rockwell bar and barbershop, and it's on the north side of the double log house. He currently is working on a monograph on the site to be part of the John Whitmer Historical Association series of Mormon sites where history and archaeology work together. We anticipate I Dig Nauvoo will continue multiple monographs to that series. They'll contribute to those, but you can see here that Richard is addressing a pretty substantial group of tourists. Their granddaughter then is posing behind the sign here. The plowed out wall remains of the barbershop were found on the lot line on the south edge of the Water Street. And the granddaughter holding the sign denotes square 5960, levels 2, and this would have been in 2014. Built with the north wall on the lot line facing Water Street, Joseph Smith presented Porter Rockwell with a prime location in what he hoped would be the busiest area of the town. The return of Rockwell from Missouri in December 1843 has been well noted in history. and a bar in the mansion followed. It remains a little uncertain whether Emma's complaint was shortly after Christmas or after her return in April, but she and the children stayed in the mansion. Joseph agreed to temporarily displace Rockwell and his bar, and Porter's bar was under construction in June of 1844 across the street to the south. One rod that is 16 and a half feet south of the wall remains along the lot line. We tested and found a corner post hole measuring 1.5 rods east. And here we say this because Mormons would use the rods where we tend to use feet and inches all the time. We put a 1-foot test, which found the corner post hole for the southeast corner of the bar and barbershop. So we got the corners of it. The alignment matched the concentration of the artifacts and daub, marking the footprint of the double log house to the south, reassuring that that calculation was also correct. Greg Scheiser has done a major service for us. This careful excavation around the electrical lines, telephone lines, gas lines, and the hedge was required to determine the location of the stand upon which Joseph Smith spoke on June 18, 1844. Governor Ford spoke from the same stand on June 27 in response to the quest for finding the bogus money or bogus blanks alleged by the non-Mormons. No post holes caused the determination that the stand was erected on the bar and barbershop foundation. It has been reconstructed and is now in use for reenactment. And it's an amazing experience to see the reenactment of the 175th anniversary of the declaration of martial law in Nauvoo. You can see the stand here with a crowd of people gathered to watch. Descendants from the original participants from as far as Utah came to validate the experience. The crowd witnessed the words as best they could be recreated, and understanding the consequences of the conflict from this distance, a special emotion swept the crowd. For the declaration of martial law from that stand and the events that followed led directly to the assassination of a presidential candidate and his brother. The disputes over religious rights versus states' rights, reparations for persons unjustly treated, and precedents of law, that is, which laws take precedence, remain. Yet they profoundly are brought to bear in this encapsulation of American history. To have the stand again in place for the reenactment speaks of the I Dig Nauvoo success, and we anticipate it is the forerunner of more reconstructions based upon archaeological investigation. I would highlight that it isn't just digging. We have site maintenance on the site as well, a consideration for the tourist traffic, especially since the site is the homestead, and to Mormons, that is iconographic. The privilege of digging here in quest of historicity is part of the privilege of leaving an historic legacy. And while we find the artifacts used by the prophet and his own, we also find their predecessors, prehistoric folks, unknown. Some mixture of the artifacts has inadvertently occurred, but some remain in situ, waiting to be disinterred. An adjunct responsibility to help maintain the site means we consult and make repairs, trying hard to do them right. The homestead needed a new set of steps. The wood ones suffered rot. Modern concrete would be easy to pour, but historic accuracy it was not. But some compromise has been made for safety. Footing is poured to support the steps, protect the guests in a house carefully restored. We leave our mark and a record, some of it photographic, to preserve, maintain, and help restore the Smith site's biographic.
Next site we did was the Samuel H. Smith site, 2014 to actually present, but because we still have a lot more to do there. But Paul, why don't you just tell us about the Samuel H. Smith site, which was a treasure trove of artifacts?
It's located on the west half of Lot 1 in the northeast corner lot of N147. That's the Mansion House block. The Hiram Clark house can be seen standing on the corner, the brick house. Hiram made a trip to Caldwell County, Missouri to retrieve the press, then for it to be used at the times and seasons. Families are encouraged to work together in this educational experience under the supervision, of course, of crew members and staff. In a half-day experience, we expect volunteers to dig in a assigned square, find artifacts in situ or in screening, wash them, identify, tabulate, and enter their artifactual contribution to the record. We also offer Boy Scouts merit badges. In this case, instructed by Riker Johansson, who is in the slightly green shirt. These scouts learn to scrape, not gouge, map in artifacts, screen their dirt, wash, identify, and tabulate their finds. An adult asked the troop why the littlest guy was in charge. His answer, well, this is my 5th year on the site. Educating our volunteers, whether adults with archaeology on their bucket list or kids earning a scouting badge, is priority of I Dig Nauvoo. Among the fascinating artifacts from the Samuel Smith site are 2 pieces of type, printer's type, like the 572 found on the Times and Seasons site. One capital N and one little c have been uncovered from the ground. Remarkable in the story that on block 147-1 they have been found. 2 blocks to the west, the Times and Seasons was published in 1839. The press having been retrieved from Caldwell County, where buried for a time. Retrieved by Hiram Clark, Samuel's neighbor to the east, who made the trip to retrieve the press to publish words of the new high priest. We found a piece of type while digging at Hahn's Mill, tying the migratory history of the Latter-day Saints to a specific handbill. Editor Don Carlos, Samuel's brother, could have tracked the type through the mud, or it could have been later, after an assassination in cold blood. Yet whether before or after, some watched the Mormon leaders die. The type represents true history, for artifacts never lie. The press had come from Kirtland, the type 6-point bourgeois, and we found a bit of history, mystery, and a little bit of awe. We have quite an assortment of artifacts. You can see the marbles, buttons, straight pins, flatware, and so forth. A great wealth of material has come out of the site, and it includes some that might be considered family heirloom. Here's a porcelain doll, probably played with by his ancestors' daughters, and Bob Smith looks with deep appreciation at one that Susanna and Mary may well have claimed as her own. The Samuel Smith site is the first where stamped spongeware has been found. Designs cut into the sponge allowed this unique design, and we have both the blue stamps between the red bands and the red and green stamps evident. Popular in Scotland by 1840, this attractive decorative strategy merits more research. And here is Becky Smith. As she worked her way into the Samuel Smith basement, Becky found a delightful assortment of artifacts predating 1870. And here she grins at the fact that some of her pieces fit together and will be able to be glued. Found by ladies from Burlington working around the fireplace, the bone domino has an as yet undeciphered benchmark, one that would have been suspiciously hard to replicate with precision, and so makes one wonder about how well people could identify them for drawing. But fascinating to see the wooden toys developed there. And here is the most fascinating wood artifact I've ever found. Found in many artifacts in a test square in the Sydney Street in front of Samuel Smith's house. This remarkably tapered, drilled, twisted, angular bone baffled half a dozen experts until Kristen Donahue, the adornment archaeologist, identified it as a lace spindle. Fascinating tool. The shallow basement uncovered is of unmortared limestone. We experimented using wet soil from the dig to build the corner in the upper right, and it lasted 2 years before it would have had to require tuck putting. The fireplace at the east end showed significant ash and reddening of the stone. The entry in the southwest corner gave access to the stone pirates who took most of the west wall, leaving the three probably because fill had made them less accessible. Material slumped in from the north, leaving questions of whether an additional structure had accompanied the 1 rod by 3/4 rod structure. In her first season on the dig, Mackenzie Quick found a key. North of Samuel's basement, the artifact filled her with glee. Her mother and her brother came with her again in 2019 to explore Nauvoo and participate in the archaeological scene. They found a Chinese coin dated 1796 to 1820, adding to their contribution finding artifacts, and they found plenty. Yet the significance of the key and the significance of the coin make their contribution special, and we celebrate that they rejoin. For some there are who are lucky, some with the Midas touch, some who raise interesting questions, and we appreciate them very much. But when you find a Chinese coin having fallen from the sky, it raises questions. How? When? Who bought it? Who lost it? Why? Joseph Sr. sold ginseng in 1820, lost his investment, enough to make one cry. Yet here on the Smith-Clark boundary in Nauvoo sits an artifact that does not lie. At the northwest corner of the Samuel Smith property, we've uncovered a deposit of demolition debris, approximately 10 feet square, with brick, limestone, and mortar. Very few artifacts. So we're waiting for further examination by our volunteer crew. We may get to it this season from May 15 to June 18, 2022. On the other hand, it seems more likely at this stage we'll be working on the Times and Seasons building, preparing it for reconstruction. But if you'd like to check into idignauvoo.com to volunteer, we are looking for people who have archaeology on their bucket list. With modern technology, we can expand the view from the 1907 photo of Old Nauvoo. Still difficult a household footprint to precisely assess, yet triangulating, probing, digging promises success. Katie Baker triangulated, reconnoitering the site, and found the small building west of the Clarks fits our basement tight. Therefore, a bigger house must be further to the west. So we have probed in open squares another season to invest, and found bricks, limestone, and mortar demolition below the plow zone, but in a 10 by 10 foot area too small for the big house to own. The result of our investigation of the space along the fence shows post holes and scattered debris, so more work must yet commence. For us to reestablish the 1840s view of the Samuel Smith's house on Sydney Street as it was in Old Nauvoo. Kristen Donahue presented the Samuel Smith buttons at our symposium, finding bone, shell, milk glass, and rubber made from petroleum. She weighed and measured more than 150 buttons from the site, then diagnosed the costumes they were intended to fasten tight. 13 costumes attributable to Samuel Smith included top coat, vest, shirts, pants, and what he wore underwith. And of course, his daughters and other folks were represented. And for Kristen, a specialist in wardrobe artifacts, the fragments and fragments of the ornamented provide glimpses into the larger picture, the one she so brilliantly expanded by showing us what we had found, washed, marked, and tabulated. We saw buttons. She saw costumes from which the buttons testified, and thus we see potential in all of our artifacts applied. Specialists in every field with interest in our 250,000 facts can study what we have to understand 19th century acts. Bone, glass, ceramics, metals, ferrous and non-ferrous like brass can be examined to educate in the American history class. So much more to learn, so many artifacts to study, and maybe we can learn peace so our future will not be so bloody. The last 2 centuries have been filled with almost continuous warring. Students like Mrs. Donahue helped write a history of our adorning.
Well, Paul, the last area we worked on Hiram Smith's office, and what we found was also a store. 2017 to 2019. Of course, the last 2 years we haven't been able to dig because of COVID, but we're looking forward to starting again.
Picture shows our bone specialist, Dr. Steve Smith, who has come many times to survey with his metal detector, indicating with golf tees and flags where metal can be expected and therefore where we should concentrate our efforts. Growth on the dump site that was Hiram's office made metal detecting difficult, but he distinguished the office area from the barn and helped us see that goods on the river level could be brought into the barn, hoisted to the store level, and sold with ready access to Water Street. Looking east toward the red brick store, you can see that the front foundation of Hiram's office store school aligns in front of the red brick store. Water Street is 66 feet wide at the mansion house. It continues straight west on the north side, but the front door of Hiram's store intrudes into the street, reducing the street to half its eastern width. Now, why was that? How did Hiram Smith justify having his front door in the middle of Water Street? Was that special privileges because he was the vice mayor? Was there less traffic from here to the west of the ferry? Was there erosion of the riverbank? Some other explanation? We'd be happy to have your commentary. Greg Scheiser returned to dig from his first 1979-80 seasons. He found the fireplace marked with ash below the Samuel Smith site, then uncovered the Porter Rockwell stand on the corner of Main and Water, and proceeded to the Hiram Smith office store, where he determined that it intruded into Water Street. We thank you, Greg, for 6 seasons of excitement and excellent production. Families working together in our beautiful weather find productive work to do in Old Nauvoo. Latter-day Saints of 2 different persuasions may find occasions to be friends as benefits accrue. Here, DeBarths and Dirkblatts, families with 1-meter plats, work to reveal history. While removing soil as the result of their toil, they expose dimensions of mystery. To do the job right on the Hiram Smith site requires kids to work with supervision. Yet, that little clause will give little pause as education expands their historic vision. The site remains under seal. Next season to reveal more of its dimension. And so we invite those with historic insight to help bring appropriate attention. An office, a store, much more to explore. Our dig has exposed some depressions, which may speak of a well, yet too early to tell if a cistern or other expressions. A foundation wall is extending its call to be brought anew into view, and so we want to invite those willing to unite in investigating Old Nauvoo. We have dignitaries on a new site. Ray, the emeritus archaeologist from Brigham Young BYU, that's Ray Matheny. Locke, the site director overseeing what we do. Riker, my grandson, every season part of the crew. Bob, the host and facilitator on the surface. What we can construe? They stand at the south end of Hiram's office store across the street from his house, William Mark's house and site next door. Bob is pointing toward a possible barn site where we should next explore. A level adjacent to the Mississippi, and another at this level beyond this back door. Consulting serves important roles. We listen to people of all sizes. Little girls with sharp eyes often find the smallest prizes. Lost gems, colorful bugs, cultural and natural enterprises. An old person may see an artifact from childhood he or she recognizes. So we consult as well as dig in the important things we do. Happy to have the insight that experience helps accrue. Happy to conjoin the info our consultants can construe as they work together investigating the heritage of Old Nauvoo. A cluster of dignitaries on the homestead lawn speaks of repeated opportunities for significant people to meet and discuss the process, prospects, and pathways to the future. Nauvoo proves to be a gathering place for many who are interested in researching and restoring the legacy found here. Site Director Lachlan Mackay, archaeologist John Walthall, Paul DeBarth, and Ken Farnsworth in the basement of the Red Brick Store, to have these gentlemen examining artifacts and share their appreciation of the history that they represent, to have them as resources to help identify, for example, the Spanish coin sewn into the armpit of a coat, or the mayor button from an elite tailor in New York, illustrates why they are considered icons of archaeology in Illinois. So the question is, why do I dig Nauvoo? It is to expand understanding of 10,000 years of human interaction on this bend in the Great River. It is to discover the remains we walk upon without ever seeing. It is to appreciate the genius of our predecessors. It is to provide opportunity for hands-on history and prehistory to educate participants in our past. It is to research for accurate memorialization of our predecessors. It is to extend the touch of our past so that we can see it, feel it, and be sensitive to it. It is to provide for an honest legacy for future generations. It is to promote the cause of Zion. And I believe that as we've had people who used to be enemies, whose ancestors were enemies, now working together in amicable relationships, that we have a step in that direction. And it is to elucidate the stories of artifacts, because the artifacts tell the truth. And finally, why I dig Nauvoo, it is to share my love for the site and its story.
Well, Paul, what's next for I Dig Nauvoo? There's a couple of things that we're doing, and wanted to kind of talk about that just really quickly. First of all, we have a problem, and that is that these wonderful artifacts are in the basement of the Red Brick Store, and wheelchair access or handicap access is just not available. So we've got preliminary approval to rebuild the Times and Seasons building, and where we would like to put the artifacts that would be handicap accessible. We're also have a unique partnership with Camp Nauvoo people. We've talked about building these prototype buildings. Samuel Summer Kitchen, Joe Smith and Lucy's double log cabin, and a Hiram Smith's prototype. We're actually now, we built from a garage, we built a fourplex, and we put drywall on there, and we hope to have that ready to go for this season, so that our students can have an opportunity to be here and to be able to help when we're not have to charge them a lot of money to stay here. Our ultimate goal is to be able to have a field school. And Paul, you didn't see this slide because I hid it from you, but we already have the name for this field school, the Paul and Rena DeBarth I Dig Nauvoo Field School. That's what we're trying to build, and to have a place to put these kids for that month and a month and a half will be important. And then, like Paul mentioned before, we'll let the Camp Nauvoo be able to rent that out and provide some income for them. But it's been a wonderful experience with iDig, and we look to continue it for many years to come.
Okay, and with that, ladies and gentlemen, we bring our evening program to a close. Thank you again to Paul and Bob for sharing with us this evening. And also thank you to our sponsors. And lastly, thanks to you, our friends in the audience, for joining us this evening and experiencing so much of Nauvoo's rich heritage. Now, I invite you all to join us again tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Central Time, when we will hear Randall Soland and Michael Allen. Randall will be presenting Nauvoo's town characters. Nauvoo's town characters and businesses in the 1960s and 70s. And Michael Allen will share a presentation called Rivertown, Boats and Boating in Old Nauvoo. It's sure to be a great night, and we hope to see you then. Good night, everyone.